Before we begin, a quick thank you to Brittany for sending in this incredible topic idea. If you enjoy what we do here on Sleep Theories, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify. It takes about 10 seconds and it genuinely means the world to us. It helps more people find the channel, and every single review makes a real difference. Now, let us begin. There is a question that has quietly haunted the greatest scientific minds of the modern era. Not a question about war or disease or the fragile mechanics of the human heart. Something older. Something that lives at the very edge of what language can hold. The question is this. In a universe that is approximately 13.8 billion years old, stretching across at least 93 billion light-years of observable space, containing an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each holding hundreds of billions of stars, is it possible that we are the most advanced thing in it? For most of human history, this question had no framework. No way to approach it scientifically. No measuring stick by which to compare a cave-dwelling ancestor painting bison on stone walls to whatever might exist in the spiral arms of a galaxy we will never visit. Then, in 1964, a Soviet astrophysicist named Nikolai Kardashev sat down and built that measuring stick, and the universe has never looked quite the same since. ACET 1. The Cosmic Measuring Stick. 1964. Nikolai Kardashev was born in Moscow in 1932, in the last years before the world tore itself apart. He came of age in the era of Sputnik and the space race, at a moment when Soviet science was reaching upward with a kind of furious ambition that only nations with something to prove can sustain. Kardashev was not a dramatic man. By most accounts he was measured, precise, quietly brilliant, the kind of scientist whose ideas outlive every headline of his era. In 1964 he published a paper titled Transmission of Information by Extraterrestrial Civilizations. The title was modest. The concept inside it was not. Kardashev's insight was elegant in the way only the most enduring scientific ideas ever are. He realized that trying to measure the advancement of an extraterrestrial civilization by looking for things like language, culture, or biology was essentially impossible. We had no reference point. We had no baseline. We were trying to measure something we had never seen with tools designed entirely for ourselves. But energy was different. Energy, Kardashev argued, was universal. It did not belong to any one species, any one chemistry, any one planet. Every civilization in the cosmos, wherever and whatever it happened to be, required energy to do anything at all. And crucially, the more energy a civilization could harness, the more it could do. The relationship between energy use and technological capability was not a human invention. It was a law of physics. So Kardashev proposed a classification system built around energy. He called it the Kardashev Scale, and he defined it in 3 tiers so clean they feel almost like a poem. A Type 1 civilization would be one capable of harnessing all of the energy available on its home planet. Every ray of sunlight striking the surface, every wind, every tide, every thermal vent on the ocean floor. Total planetary mastery. Kardashev estimated this would correspond to a power output of roughly 10 to the 16th watts. A Type 2 civilization would have moved beyond the planet entirely, capturing the complete energy output of its host star. Not just the light that happened to fall on one rocky world, all of it. The full, relentless fusion-powered output of an entire stellar body, a power level roughly 10 billion times greater than Type 1, and a Type 3 civilization, the category that lives at the boundary of what the human mind can actually visualize, would harness the energy of an entire galaxy, every star, every pulsar, every quasar, an incomprehensible scale of power, somewhere around 10 to the 44 watts, that makes our entire civilization feel roughly as significant as a single match burning in the middle of an ocean. The paper was received with interest in the Soviet scientific community. It spread gradually through Western astronomy over the following years, and then something subtle but important happened. Scientists stopped treating it as pure philosophy and started asking a genuinely frightening question. If civilizations at these levels exist somewhere in the universe, and given the sheer scale of what is out there, the probability is not trivial. then their energy use should be detectable. The signature of a civilization consuming the output of an entire star would leave marks on the universe. We just had to know what we were looking for. The more energy a civilization can harness, the more it can do, and the more it does, the louder it becomes to anyone listening carefully enough. In the decades following Kardashev's paper, astronomers began quietly asking themselves what those marks might actually look like. The answers they arrived at were stranger, and in some ways more unsettling than anything science fiction had imagined. But to understand where the search went, you first have to understand where it began. Acte 2, The Search Begins, Project Ozma and the Birth of SETI. 4 years before Kardashev published his classification system, a young American astronomer named Frank Drake sat inside the Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia and pointed a radio telescope at a star 85 light-years away. It was 1960. The project was called Ozma, named for the princess of the fictional land of Oz, a place, Drake noted, very far away, difficult to reach, and populated by strange and exotic beings. The telescope listened in silence for roughly 200 hours across two nearby, sun-like stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. Drake and his team were hunting for patterns, repeating structured signals that could not be explained by any known natural source. They found nothing. But Project Ozma was not a failure in any meaningful sense. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that humanity now possessed the technological capability to reach across interstellar distances and listen. The idea propagated through the scientific community like a held breath finally released. Over the following 2 decades, the search formalized. Dozens of independent radio telescope programs launched around the world. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, grew from a loose collection of passionate researchers into an organized scientific endeavor with its own institute, its own protocols, and its own increasingly sophisticated instruments. The underlying logic was straightforward. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. They can carry information, and any civilization advanced enough to transmit them would likely have realized they were the ideal medium for interstellar communication. So we listened. We built bigger ears, and we listened harder. Decades passed. The universe remained, as far as anyone could confirm, silent. There was one extraordinary exception, and the scientific community has debated its significance ever since. In August of 1977, a volunteer researcher at Ohio State University named Jerry Eman was reviewing printouts from the Big Ear radio telescope when he circled a sequence of characters and wrote a single word in the margin. Wow. The signal, now known simply as the WOW signal, lasted approximately 72 seconds, matched the expected profile of an interstellar transmission almost perfectly, and has never been detected again. Its origin has never been confirmed. No natural explanation has achieved scientific consensus. It remains, more than 40 years later, the single most compelling unexplained radio detection in the history of SETI research. But here is the thing that the architects of SETI gradually came to understand, and that Kardashev's framework quietly predicted all along. A civilization advanced enough to register on the upper tiers of the Kardashev Scale would not communicate by radio. Radio was what a civilization used when it was at roughly our level of development. Early, local, broadcasting into the void, and hoping something was close enough to hear. A Type 2 civilization would not need to broadcast. It would not be trying to reach out across the stars from a single point on a single planet. A Type 2 civilization would have rearranged the stars themselves, and that rearrangement, that act of incomprehensible cosmic engineering, would produce a signature of an entirely different kind. ACE 3. The Dyson Sphere, engineering on a stellar scale. Freeman Dyson was one of the most unusual scientific minds of the 20th century. Born in England in 1923, he spent the majority of his career at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the same institution that once housed Albert Einstein, and he became known for a particular kind of thinking that inhabited the borderlands between rigorous physics and radical imagination. He was the kind of scientist who, when presented with the laws of physics, immediately began asking what they permitted that no one had yet tried. In 1960, the same year Frank Drake pointed a telescope at Tau Ceti, Dyson published a paper in the journal Science titled Search for Artificial Stellar Sources of Infrared Radiation. It was brief, it was almost offhand in its tone, and it contained one of the most conceptually explosive ideas in the history of astrobiology. Dyson pointed out that any civilization experiencing continuous population growth would eventually reach a hard limit imposed by energy. On a planet, there is only so much sunlight. The civilization would need more. The most logical response, at least from an engineering standpoint, would be to move outward, to dismantle unused planetary material and redistribute it around the host star in a vast shell or swarm of structures designed to capture the star's full energy output. He called this a biosphere of artificial origin. The popular imagination, somewhat against his wishes, called it a Dyson sphere. Dyson was careful to note that he was not necessarily describing a solid shell. The engineering challenges of a rigid sphere surrounding an entire star are essentially insurmountable even in theory. What he imagined was more likely a dense swarm of habitats, solar collectors, and infrastructure orbiting the star at close range, what later theorists called a Dyson swarm. But the crucial detail was this: a Dyson sphere or swarm, by capturing virtually all of its star's visible light, would make that star invisible or nearly invisible to conventional optical telescopes. The star would appear to have vanished, but it would not have gone cold. All of that captured energy would eventually be radiated away as waste heat, specifically as infrared radiation, invisible to the naked eye, detectable to the right instruments. Dyson proposed that astronomers searching for extraterrestrial intelligence should not be hunting for radio signals from individual planets. They should be hunting for stars that had dimmed or disappeared, stars with anomalous infrared signatures, stars that behaved as though something unimaginably large was wrapped around them. This idea sat at the intersection of astrophysics and engineering speculation for the next 50 years. Scientists ran searches, infrared surveys scanned the sky, candidate stars were identified, investigated, and one by one explained away by natural phenomena. Dust shells, planetary nebulae, circumstellar disks. Until 1968, when a theoretical physicist named Freeman Dyson, still alive, still thinking, watched from his study as a new generation of space telescopes began sending back data he had not anticipated. And until 2015, when an astronomer in Louisiana put her name to a discovery that briefly made the entire world look up. Act 4, the strange star, Tabby's star, and the anomaly that would not explain itself. Tabitha Boyajian was an astronomer at Louisiana State University when her name became permanently attached to one of the most discussed and contested astronomical discoveries of the 21st century. She did not discover the star herself. The Kepler Space Telescope did, as part of its years-long survey of 150,000 stars in a small patch of sky between the constellations Cygnus and Lyra. But it was Boyajian who led the team that identified what was happening to it, and so the star, officially catalogued as KIC8462852, became known almost immediately as Tabby's star. The Kepler telescope had been designed to detect exoplanets. Its method was elegant in its simplicity. Stare at a field of stars continuously and watch for the tiny regular dips in brightness that occur when a planet transits across the face of its host star. A planet the size of Jupiter crossing a sun-like star might cause the star's measured brightness to dip by roughly 1%. A planet the size of Earth would produce a dip of around 0.01%. Both were detectable. Both followed predictable patterns, regular, periodic, matching the geometry of orbital mechanics. What Kepler recorded from KIC 8462852 did not match any of these expected patterns, not even close. The star's brightness dropped by 22% on one occasion, by 15% on another. The dips were irregular, aperiodic, sometimes occurring in clusters, sometimes in isolation. They lasted days, sometimes weeks. Some dips had smooth edges. Others were asymmetric, with sharp drops followed by gradual recoveries that didn't match any standard stellar model. and over the full length of the Kepler mission, the star appeared to be slowly but measurably fading, dimming by roughly 3% over 4 years, then by a further 2% in a period of only 200 days. No planet caused that. No comet swarm caused that. At least not one any existing model could account for. No known natural phenomenon in the entire literature of stellar physics produced a light curve that looked anything like what Kepler had captured from this single, otherwise unremarkable star 1,480 light-years from Earth. Boyajian's team published their findings in September of 2015. The paper was careful, measured, thorough. It listed every natural hypothesis the team had considered and walked through the evidentiary problems with each one. And then, almost reluctantly, it acknowledged in passing that one hypothesis had not been ruled out, that the dips might be caused by some form of artificial megastructure orbiting the star. The scientific press did not treat that sentence as a cautious footnote. Within days, the story was everywhere. Tabby's star, the alien megastructure star, the Dyson Sphere candidate. For a period of several weeks, a genuinely mainstream scientific discussion unfolded in public view about whether a telescope had just detected the physical signature of a civilization operating at a scale that dwarfed anything in human history. Astronomers weighed in from every corner of the discipline. The responses ranged from enthusiastic to dismissive. Jason Wright of Penn State, one of the astrophysicists most closely associated with the theoretical search for Dyson structures, was notably measured in his response. He said that a swarm of structures built by an alien civilization was the most exotic explanation, but that it should not be ruled out entirely until the star's behaviour had been properly explained by natural means. That explanation proved elusive. 1,480 light-years away, a star was doing something the entire field of stellar physics could not explain. And the explanation no one wanted to say out loud was the one the data kept pointing toward. Follow-up observations were conducted at multiple observatories around the world. Infrared data was analysed. Historical photographic plates going back to the late 1800s were examined, and they appeared to show the star had been fading for at least a century, a discovery that seemed, paradoxically, to argue against the alien hypothesis, since no known technology could cause sustained directional fading over that timescale. Additional analysis suggested dust, possibly cometary dust, as a more likely culprit than solid structures, because dust scattered light in a way that matched certain features of the dimming profile. By 2017, most of the scientific community had settled cautiously on some form of dust as the most plausible natural explanation. The alien megastructure hypothesis retreated from the mainstream, but it did not disappear, and the people who had not stopped watching the data began noticing things that the official explanations did not fully account for. ACT-5. The data that changed. What the archives. Quietly recorded here is where the story moves from verified astronomy into the contested territory that conspiracy theorists have spent years mapping out. The facts above, the Kepler data, the Boyajian paper, the dust hypothesis, those are documented and publicly available. What follows is what certain researchers claim happened after the public spotlight moved on. When Tabby's star first made international headlines, a network of independent astronomers and amateur researchers mobilised rapidly. The star was observable from ground-based telescopes, and a citizen science project called Planet Hunters had actually been among the first to flag its anomalous behaviour in the Kepler data. This was a genuinely public investigation, at least in its early stages. Thousands of people were watching. Some of those independent researchers began compiling observations from multiple telescope networks, comparing archival infrared data against optical measurements, cross-referencing the timing of dimming events against measurements from observatories that had not been part of the formal study. And according to a small but persistent group within this community, what they found did not align cleanly with the dust hypothesis. The infrared signature during some of the largest dimming events was, they argued, inconsistent with what cometary dust actually produces. Dust should scatter and absorb light relatively uniformly across different wavelengths, producing a characteristic infrared excess as the material warms from stellar radiation. What some researchers reported instead was a more complex spectral signature, one that, in their analysis, suggested the blocking material had unusual properties that basic dust clouds did not explain. These analyses were largely self-published or shared within independent research communities. They did not achieve peer-reviewed status. The mainstream consensus held, but the secondary debate did not end there. Some observers within the independent community began noting that access to certain archival datasets from orbiting observatories, particularly from infrared space telescopes, became more complicated in the period following the initial wave of scientific attention on KIC 8462852. Requests for raw data that had previously been processed and released on standard timelines appeared, in some cases, to involve longer delays or limited public availability windows. In at least a few instances, researchers reported difficulties accessing data they believed should have been in the public domain under the standard open data policies of major space agencies. None of this constitutes proof of anything. Data management challenges, administrative delays, processing backlogs. These are the ordinary and unglamorous realities of operating large scientific infrastructure. The explanations are almost always mundane, almost always. What the conspiracy theory community latched onto was not any single instance of inaccessible data, but the pattern, and more specifically the timing. The data access difficulties, they argued, clustered around the period of peak scientific and public interest in Tabby's star, and when the dust hypothesis became the dominant public narrative and media attention faded, the independent research community gradually lost the momentum it had briefly built. The star continued its slow, irregular dimming. No comprehensive explanation that satisfied every observed anomaly was ever formally published, and a small group of researchers continued watching it, quietly, from their own observatories and computers, convinced that the official narrative had closed a door that the evidence had not yet warranted closing. AC6. The Hidden Search. What governments may already know to understand why anyone might believe that governments are quietly conducting a separate, classified search for Kardashev-level civilizations, you have to first understand the strategic implications of such a discovery. If a Type 2 or Type 3 civilization exists, a civilization that has mastered stellar or galactic energy on scales that make our entire technological history look like a match struck in a hurricane, the geopolitical and philosophical consequences of confirming that fact publicly would be unlike anything in human experience. Not the discovery of a new continent, not the invention of nuclear weapons, not the mapping of the human genome, something categorically different. Every government on Earth, every military institution, every intelligence agency would immediately confront the same series of questions simultaneously. Are we being observed? Have we been observed? What does this civilization want, if anything? Is it possible to communicate with it? Is it possible to threaten it? And most urgently, does any other nation already know? And if so, what strategic advantage have they derived from that knowledge? The geopolitical calculus of a confirmed Kardashev-level civilization is terrifying from the perspective of any government tasked with managing national stability, which is why, theorists argue, any such discovery would almost certainly be handled precisely the way governments handle every other category of information that could produce widespread panic or destabilize international power structures, quietly, securely, behind classification barriers that may never expire. There is documented precedent for government-sponsored astronomy, programs operating outside public scientific channels. The National Reconnaissance Office maintains a fleet of classified imaging satellites whose capabilities exceed those of publicly disclosed systems. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has funded research into physics and materials science well in advance of anything in the academic literature. The intelligence community has, on multiple documented occasions, developed and operated scientific capabilities that were only partially declassified decades after the fact. Conspiracy theorists argue that the search for Kardashev-level civilizations represents exactly the kind of research that would receive this treatment. They point to several specific claims. First, that classified infrared satellite networks, systems capable of detecting the specific heat signatures associated with Dyson structures have been operational since at least the 1980s, decades before publicly acknowledged infrared observatories achieved comparable capabilities. These systems, the theory goes, were initially designed for missile detection, but were subsequently repurposed as the scientific community began developing specific spectral signatures to associate with advanced alien engineering. Second, that the data gathered by publicly available space telescopes, Kepler Spitzer, the Wide-Field Infrared Survey Explorer, is first processed through analytical pipelines that flag anomalous stellar behaviour before the data reaches civilian scientists. Anything that crosses certain thresholds, theorists suggest, is routed through a secondary review before public release. The official timeline of data availability, they argue, accommodates this step invisibly. Third, that certain anomalous stellar objects, not just Tabby's star but several others identified in large survey catalogues, have had their public classification quietly revised from unexplained to natural variable in the period following initial discovery, without corresponding publication of the observational data that justified the reclassification. None of this is documented fact. The evidence base for each of these claims is fragmentary, circumstantial, and filtered through communities whose epistemological standards do not always align with those of peer-reviewed science. But the underlying logic, that a discovery of this magnitude would be handled differently from ordinary scientific findings, is not inherently unreasonable. It is in fact the conclusion that many serious academics have reached when modelling the theoretical contact scenario for extraterrestrial intelligence. The question is not whether governments would suppress such information. The question is whether there is anything to suppress. Act 7. The Fermi Paradox. The silence that should not exist. In the summer of 1950, over lunch at Los Alamos National Laboratory, Enrico Fermi was in conversation with several colleagues about a recent newspaper cartoon depicting flying saucers being stolen by little green men. The conversation drifted, as conversations among physicists tend to do, toward the more serious underlying question. If the universe is as old and as vast as it appears to be, and if the laws of physics that produce life here apply elsewhere, why has humanity never encountered any evidence of another civilization? Fermi reportedly paused at some point and asked, with the particular directness of a man who had built the first nuclear reactor, "But where is everybody?" The question outlived the lunch. It became one of the defining puzzles of modern astrophysics, known as the Fermi Paradox, the apparent contradiction between the high statistical probability of extraterrestrial civilizations and the total absence of confirmed contact. Let us sit with the scale of that contradiction for a moment, because it is genuinely staggering. The Milky Way is approximately 100,000 light years in diameter. It contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Roughly 2/3 of those stars are older than our own Sun, meaning they have had more time to develop planetary systems, and those systems have had more time to develop whatever conditions are necessary for life. Current estimates, based on the Kepler telescope's exoplanet surveys, suggest that the Milky Way alone contains somewhere between 40 billion and 80 billion potentially habitable planets. Even if the fraction of those planets that develop life is vanishingly small, even if only 1 in a billion crosses the threshold from chemistry to biology, we would still expect millions of living worlds in our own galaxy. And even if the fraction of living worlds that develop intelligence is equally small, 1 in a million, we would still expect thousands of intelligent civilizations scattered across the Milky Way. And even if the fraction of intelligent civilizations that achieve the technological sophistication to become detectable is tiny, even a single civilization that reached Type 2 level a mere billion years before us would have had, in principle, enough time to colonize or at least influence every star system in the galaxy many times over. We see none of this. We hear none of this. The sky is quiet in every wavelength we have learned to listen to. Over the decades since Fermi asked his question, scientists and philosophers have proposed dozens of solutions to the paradox. They range from the sobering to the genuinely terrifying. Perhaps intelligent life is simply far rarer than the statistics suggest. an extraordinary accident of chemistry and circumstance that has occurred exactly once in the observable universe, here, on this particular rocky world orbiting this particular unremarkable star. Perhaps intelligent civilizations reliably destroy themselves before reaching the stage where they become detectable, through warfare, ecological collapse, artificial intelligence, or some other mechanism we have not yet encountered. Perhaps there is a filter ahead of us rather than behind us. Perhaps the universe is populated with civilizations that have no interest in contact, or that have concluded that contact is dangerous, or that communicate in ways our instruments cannot detect. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that sits at the heart of everything this documentary has been building toward, perhaps the most advanced civilizations in the universe are not broadcasting at all, not because they don't exist, not because they're hiding, but because the signatures of their existence are so far beyond the scale of what our instruments can currently measure that we are looking at them every night without understanding what we're seeing. A galaxy full of Type 3 civilizations would not look like a galaxy of alien radio broadcasts. It would look like a galaxy of unusual infrared, sources, anomalous stellar behaviour, stars dimming on irregular schedules, energy signatures that don't match known astrophysical models. It would look, in other words, exactly like certain things astronomers have been quietly cataloguing and failing to explain for decades. Perhaps the Fermi paradox is not a silence. Perhaps it is a signal, one we simply do not yet know how to read. Act 8. The final theory. What Kardashev may have known, here is where the conspiracy theory reaches its most ambitious claim, and also, paradoxically, its most intellectually serious one. The conventional narrative around Nikolai Kardashev and his classification scale is that it was a theoretical exercise, a thought experiment about the thermodynamic limits of technological civilization, a useful framework for thinking about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but ultimately speculative, built on assumptions about what advanced civilizations might do based on extrapolating from human behaviour and human physics. The conspiracy narrative says something slightly different. It says the Kardashev Scale was not developed to imagine what advanced civilizations might look like. It was developed because there was already evidence that they existed, and the scale was a tool for classifying what Soviet astronomers were beginning to find in radio and infrared data from across the galaxy. The Soviet space program of the 1960s was, in significant ways, more aggressive in its scientific scope than its American counterpart. While NASA was publicly focused on the moon, Soviet astronomers were conducting wide-field surveys of the radio sky with instruments that produced vast quantities of unanalyzed data. Kardashev himself was a senior figure at the Soviet Institute of Space Research, an institution with access to classified observation programs that operated in parallel with the public scientific enterprise. What the conspiracy theory suggests is that anomalous radio and infrared readings that matched no known natural source and that displayed characteristics consistent with what Kardashev's framework would predict for a Type 2 or Type 3 civilization, were detected in Soviet observatory data as early as the early 1960s. It suggests further that the Kardashev Scale was, at least in part, developed as an internal classification tool, a way for Soviet scientists to systematize what they were finding without making explicit public claims about extraterrestrial civilizations that would have been scientifically, politically, and strategically explosive. It suggests that American intelligence services, monitoring Soviet scientific publications as a matter of routine Cold War intelligence practice, recognized what the Kardashev paper actually represented, not a theoretical model but a codification of empirical discoveries, and initiated their own classified program to investigate the same anomalies from American observatories. And it suggests that over the following 6 decades, as telescope technology advanced and the catalogue of unexplained astronomical anomalies expanded, this parallel classified investigation has continued, growing more sophisticated, gathering more data, and reaching conclusions that have never been shared with the scientific community at large or with the public. The theorists who advance this narrative acknowledge freely that they cannot prove it. The evidence is fragmentary, circumstantial, and filtered through decades of second-hand accounts and pattern matching from data that is not fully available to independent researchers. They are not claiming certainty. They are claiming that the weight of the available evidence, the anomalies that natural models fail to fully explain, the data access complications, the pattern of public scientific narratives being quietly revised, the strategic logic of classification all points in a consistent direction. That somewhere in the classified archives of at least two major world powers, there are observations that have never been made public. Observations that, if released, would not end the debate about whether advanced extraterrestrial civilizations exist. They would begin one. Act 9. The Scale of What We Are. Humanity in the Kardashev Framework. Step back from the conspiracy for a moment. Step back from Tabby's Star and classified archives and the Cold War and the quiet data access irregularities. Step back from all of it, and let us simply look at where humanity actually sits on the scale that Nikolai Kardashev drew in 1964. The astronomer Carl Sagan, who was among the most influential popularizers of the Kardashev framework in the Western scientific tradition, extended the scale downward, adding decimal points to represent the vast space between Type 0 and Type 1. By Sagan's formula, a civilization's Kardashev rating could be calculated from its total energy consumption. He estimated that humanity, as of the 1973 publication of his extension of the framework, sat at approximately Type 0.7. Contemporary estimates place humanity closer to 0.73. Perhaps, accounting for renewable energy growth over the past decade, as high as 0.75. We are not yet a Type 1 civilization. We have not yet achieved full mastery of our own planet's available energy. We still burn ancient carbon stores because we have not yet covered enough of our deserts with solar panels, have not yet captured enough of our winds, have not yet tapped enough of the geothermal gradient that exists 6 kilometers below our feet at virtually every point on Earth's surface. The physicist Michio Kaku has estimated that humanity could reach Type 1 civilization status within the next 100 to 200 years, assuming continued technological development and the successful transition to renewable energy. Type 2, he suggests, might be achievable in a few thousand years. Type 3 in something between 100,000 and 1 million years. These timescales are almost too large to hold in a human mind. 1 million years ago, our ancestors were Homo erectus. They carried hand axes. They had not yet controlled fire. The entire arc of everything we consider civilization, agriculture, writing, cities, science, space travel, has unfolded in roughly the last 10,000 years. And yet, in a universe that is 13.8 billion years old, 1 million years is not long. It is approximately 0.007% of the universe's current age. In cosmic terms, it is a breath, an eye blink, a margin of error. Which means that any civilization that achieved our current level of development 1 million years before we did, and the universe has had billions of years during which this could have happened around billions of stars, would have had enough time to traverse the entire Kardashev scale, from Type 1 to Type 2 to Type 3, from planetary mastery to stellar mastery to galactic mastery. The thought is not frightening in the way science fiction has trained us to expect. There is no invasion fleet, no War of the Worlds scenario playing out above our stratosphere. What is genuinely, quietly, unsettlingly possible is something stranger, that we live inside a galaxy that is not empty, has never been empty, and that we simply lack the conceptual and instrumental framework to perceive what fills it. That we are, in the Kardashev framework, approximately as capable of detecting the activity of a Type 3 civilization as a medieval peasant would be of detecting the internet. The signals are there, the infrastructure is real, we simply cannot see it with the eyes we currently have. A-Seat 10. The Silent Keepers. Those who study what they cannot publish. There is a community of researchers, not fringe, not paranoid, but quietly serious, who have made the study of anomalous astronomical data this central project of their professional lives. They operate mostly in the margins of institutional science, retired astrophysicists continuing their work through independent observatories, astronomers who publish within the mainstream but maintain a second body of research that circulates through private channels, mathematicians and signal processing experts who analyse raw telescope data, looking for patterns that automated pipelines might flag and filter before a human ever sees them. What unites this community is not a shared conclusion. They do not all believe that the data they are studying represents extraterrestrial intelligence. Many of them are genuinely agnostic about that possibility. What unites them is a shared suspicion that the official categories, natural stellar variability, instrumental artifact, unexplained transient event, are sometimes applied prematurely before the data has been exhaustively analysed, and that this premature application occasionally closes off lines of investigation that deserved more time. Several members of this community have gone on the record, in podcasts, in independently published papers, and in occasional mainstream interviews, with claims that sit at the edge of what official science is currently willing to acknowledge. One recurring claim is that the catalogue of anomalous stellar objects, stars whose behaviour falls outside existing models, is significantly larger than the publicly available literature suggests. Surveys like the Kepler mission and its successor, TESS, have identified thousands of stars with light curves that automated systems flag as requiring explanation. Most of these receive explanations quickly and are filed accordingly, but a non-trivial fraction, estimates within the independent community range from dozens to hundreds, remain in a state of limbo, not officially explained, not officially investigated further, not publicly highlighted, but not discarded either. They sit in archives. They wait. Another recurring claim is that the spectral signatures of certain anomalous objects, when analysed at wavelengths beyond the standard optical and near-infrared range, display characteristics that are difficult to reconcile with any known natural emission mechanism. These claims are almost never peer-reviewed because the data required to support or refute them is not fully accessible. The claim cannot be verified by independent researchers, it cannot be falsified either, and then there are the accounts, lower on the evidentiary hierarchy but persistent enough to warrant mention, from former employees of major space agencies and observatory networks who describe internal protocols for handling data that matches specific anomaly profiles. These accounts are second-hand, usually anonymous, and impossible to verify, but they describe a consistent process: flagging, secondary review, reclassification, archiving, a quiet administrative pipeline for data that does not fit neatly into existing categories. What all of this amounts to, in the most charitable interpretation, is an institutional tendency toward conservatism in the face of potentially extraordinary findings, a preference for mundane explanations that is a perfectly rational feature of good science, but that, in edge cases, might cause genuinely significant data to be filed away before it has been properly understood. What it amounts to, in the less charitable interpretation, is exactly what the conspiracy theorists have been arguing all along: a slow, systematic, institutional process of making extraordinary evidence look ordinary. Epilogue: the cosmic ladder. What comes next? There is a moment that occurs in the life of every civilization, or so the Kardashev framework implies, when energy becomes the limiting factor, when the planet is full and the sun beckons, and the question is no longer how to survive but how to expand, how to become something larger than the world that made you. Humanity is approaching that moment, not tomorrow, not in any individual lifetime, but the trajectory is visible. The solar panels spreading across rooftops and deserts, the early prototypes of fusion reactors that might, within this century, finally deliver on 50 years of promises, the first crewed missions back to the moon, and eventually to Mars and eventually beyond. The slow, grinding, expensive, magnificent process of a species deciding it will not remain confined to a single fragile world orbiting a single middle-aged star in a galaxy of several 100 billion others. Kardashev died in 2019. He had spent more than 5 decades thinking about what civilizations become when they are given enough time and enough energy. He never publicly claimed that his scale had been built in response to observed anomalies. He never suggested the data was being suppressed. He remained, by all accounts, a careful and conventional scientist who believed the search was ongoing and the universe was full of possibilities that humanity had not yet developed the tools to properly investigate. But he did, in the final years of his life, express something that has stayed with everyone who has studied his work. He said that the absence of detected civilizations did not discourage him, that the universe was old enough and large enough that the probability of our being alone in it, truly alone, uniquely alone, the sole possessors of technological consciousness in the entire observable cosmos, seemed to him extraordinarily low. He believed quietly and consistently that the silence was a function of our instruments, not of the universe's content, that we were not hearing nothing, we were hearing everything, and did not yet know how to listen. Consider what it would actually mean to know, not to suspect, not to theorize, not to file a paper proposing the possibility, but to genuinely know, with the kind of certainty that transforms a scientific conjecture into an established fact. To know that somewhere in this galaxy there exists, or has existed, a civilization that has captured the complete energy output of its star, that has built structures on a scale that makes our entire space program, our rockets, our satellites, our telescopes, our proud and fragile International Space Station, look like a child's drawing of a rocket ship on a piece of notebook paper. What would that knowledge do to us? Not to governments, not to militaries, not to intelligence agencies running strategic calculus about geopolitical implications. To us, ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary cities on this warm, improbable, magnificently alive planet that is currently the only confirmed address of anything capable of asking the question. Some researchers who have spent their careers in this space believe the answer is that it would liberate us, that knowing we are not alone, even if contact is impossible, even if the civilization in question is millions of light years away and perhaps long extinct, would fundamentally reframe what it means to be human in a way that renders our petty conflicts and our tribal anxieties and our desperate clinging to the illusion of cosmic importance simply, permanently, and mercifully absurd. That the knowledge would make us larger, others believe it would devastate us. That the confrontation with something so far beyond our current capabilities would produce not wonder but despair, a vertiginous sense of smallness that no philosophy or religion or political system has ever prepared our nervous systems to absorb, that the knowledge would make us smaller. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the same knowledge that liberated some would shatter others, and the process of integrating it into human civilization would take generations and produce consequences none of us can predict. Perhaps that is precisely why, if anyone knows, they have decided that we are not ready. Not yet. Not until the civilization doing the discovering has itself climbed a little further up the ladder. Not until we have learned to use our own planet's energy with something resembling wisdom, before we are handed the knowledge that someone else has already surpassed it, by orders of magnitude that our mathematics can describe, but our imaginations cannot inhabit. So here we are, in the early years of the 21st century, on a planet warming under the exhaust of a civilization that has not yet learned to harness even the energy available at home. We carry devices more powerful than the computers that put humans on the moon, and we use them to argue with strangers and watch each other sleep. We point our best telescopes at the sky and find stars that dim in ways we cannot explain, and we file those observations under dust and move on to the next data set. And somewhere, 1,480 light-years away, or 10,000 or 100,000, something that may or may not be a civilization continues doing whatever it is doing, dimming its star on an irregular schedule, radiating waste heat into the infrared, existing, if it exists, on a scale that makes the word civilization feel like a category error. The Kardashev Scale was always more than a classification system. It was a mirror. It showed us not just what we might find in the universe, but what we were, small, early, energetically modest, beginning the long climb towards something we can barely imagine. And it asked us a question we have not yet fully confronted. What if we are not the ones doing the searching? What if, somewhere on the far end of the scale, something has already found us, and is simply waiting to see what we become? The Kepler Space Telescope ran out of fuel in October of 2018. In its 9 years of operation, it observed more than 500,000 stars and confirmed the existence of 2,662 exoplanets, with thousands more awaiting verification. It transformed our understanding of how common planetary systems are, how diverse they can be, and how many of those planets sit within the habitable zones of their stars. It also left behind a catalogue of anomalies, stars with light curves that match none of its official classification categories, stars that dipped and rose and faded and brightened in ways that kept astronomers occupied long after the mission ended. The data is public. The archives are accessible. Anyone with the right software and enough computational patience can go looking through it. Some people do exactly that. Every day, somewhere on Earth, a retired physics professor or a software engineer with an astronomy hobby, or a graduate student between official projects sits down with a coffee going cold beside a keyboard and pulls another piece of raw Kepler data onto a screen and looks at what a star 1,000 light-years away was doing a decade ago. Most of what they find has a clean, boring explanation. A binary star system, an orbiting planet with an eccentric orbit, an instrumental glitch that got caught in the pipeline and never properly cleaned out. But occasionally they find something that doesn't resolve, and they sit with it for a while, running tests, cross-referencing other wavelengths, checking for correlations in archival data from other observatories. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they conclude that the official classification doesn't actually fit the data. That the category labelled natural variability was applied to something that the natural variability models don't fully account for. And then they face the decision that every researcher faces when their data points somewhere uncomfortable. Do they publish what the data actually shows and absorb the reputational cost of being associated with extraordinary claims in a discipline that treats extraordinary claims as radioactive? Or do they file it quietly, note it in their private records, and wait for the instruments of the next generation to either confirm or refute what the current generation's instruments have suggested? Most choose the latter, not out of fear, not out of conspiracy, but because that is what scientific caution looks like in practice. You do not shout until you are certain. And in this particular field, certainty is a very long way away, but the data accumulates, the archive grows, and the question Kardashev asked in 1964, the question about what advanced civilizations look like from the outside, from a distance of centuries or millennia of technological development, has never been more precisely framed, never been more instrumentally approachable, and never been less definitively answered. The ladder is there, the rungs are visible, humanity is somewhere near the bottom, looking up. The question of who, or what, might already be at the top remains for now exactly where Nikolai Kardashev left it. Open, unanswered, and darker than the space between the stars. Sleep well, or don't. Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps more than you could possibly know and makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Alright, let's get into tonight's investigation. The file sat in his hands like a live grenade. Evan Hartley had been working at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland for 8 months. It was June of 1998, a Thursday afternoon that had started like every other. The archive facility was a massive concrete structure that housed billions of documents, the collective memory of American government stretching back centuries. Hartley worked in Section 7, a climate-controlled vault 3 floors below ground level, where the most sensitive to classified materials were processed before being made available to researchers. His job was simple, if tedious. Sort through newly declassified intelligence records, catalogue them according to the established system, and prepare them for public access. Box after box of Cold War-era documents, most of them mundane reports about Soviet grain production or diplomatic cable traffic. Some were fascinating glimpses into the machinery of espionage, but none of them had ever felt dangerous before. Until he opened the mislabeled Defense Intelligence Agency container, the box was one of 20 that had arrived that morning from a storage facility in Pennsylvania. Hartley had already processed 9 of them without incident. Standard wartime logistics documentation, exactly what the label promised. Requests for boots, fuel, ammunition, medicine, the mundane necessities of keeping an army in the field. But box number 10 was different. Inside, beneath 3 inches of actual supply requisitions that seemed authentic enough, was a folder that didn't belong. The folder itself was unremarkable, standard government issue manila, slightly yellowed with age, but the tab bore a label that made Hartley's pulse quicken. Paperclip-classified supplement-not for release. He set down his coffee cup and pulled the folder out carefully as if it might crumble at his touch. The weight felt wrong. Too heavy for just a few documents. His hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. Everyone knew about Operation Paperclip. It was the famous program that brought German scientists to America after World War II, the one that gave us Werner von Braun and the space program. Hartley had processed paperclip documents before. They were fascinating historical artifacts, and most of them had been declassified, years ago. Researchers came from around the world to study them. But this was marked as classified, decades after most paperclip files had been opened to researchers, decades after the program itself had officially ended. The archive was quiet around him. The only sound was the low hum of the climate control system and the occasional distant footstep from the hallway above. Hartley glanced toward the security camera in the corner of the room. Its red light blinked steadily, recording everything as always. He opened the folder carefully. The first item was a black and white photograph, slightly faded but clear enough. The edges were crisp, professionally developed. Government photography from the post-war period had a distinctive quality, and this matched it perfectly. The photo showed Werner von Braun, unmistakable with his sharp features and confident smile, standing in what appeared to be a military office. Von Braun wore civilian clothes, a dark suit and tie. Standing with him were 3 men in United States Army uniforms. 2 wore the insignia of colonels. The third, standing slightly apart from the others, wore captain's bars but no unit designation that Hartley could identify. But these weren't the officers usually photographed with von Braun. Hartley had seen hundreds of paperclip photographs during his months in the archives. He had studied the key figures, memorized their faces. These 3 men were completely unfamiliar. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil in a neat hand, Fort Strong's Secure Facility, July 1947, Eclipse Preliminary Briefing. Hartley felt his mouth go dry. Fort Strong was a real place, an army installation in Massachusetts, but he had never encountered any reference to Eclipse in connection with paperclip. The second item made his stomach tighten into a knot. It was a typed list on official War Department letterhead, dated August 1947. German names, 23 of them, each with a birth date and a field of specialization listed beside them. Hartley ran his fingers down the list slowly. He recognized none of the names, not one, and he had studied the paperclip rosters extensively. Every historian working on the program used the same master lists, compiled from multiple sources over decades of research. These names appeared on none of them. The specialisations were unusual too, not rocket science or aeronautical engineering. Instead, he saw entries like neurological field manipulation, bioelectromagnetic interface systems, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation, psychotronic weapons development, non-local consciousness research. Beside each name was a handwritten notation in red ink: Cat 2 Specialist, Category 2. Hartley had never encountered that designation in any paperclip documentation. The third document was a memorandum on Office of Strategic Services letterhead dated October 21st, 1947. The header read, Project Eclipse, Dash Continuation Protocols and Security Requirements. The text was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic style of military intelligence. Eclipse researchers will continue where the Reich left off. Subjects must remain off record. Scientific potential outweighs public risk. Transfer to designated facilities to proceed under compartmentalized oversight. Category 2, specialists to remain separated from NASA track personnel at all times. No cross-program communication authorized. Standard paperclip documentation procedures do not apply to Eclipse subjects. All records to be maintained separately from main paperclip archive. Classification level to exceed top secret. Access restricted to need-to-know basis as determined by Oversight Committee. It was signed at the bottom in a strong angular hand. William J. Donovan, Major General, United States Army. Hartley felt his hands begin to shake. He set the memo down and stared at the signature. William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary spy chief, the man who had founded the Office of Strategic Services, America's first centralized intelligence agency, and led it through World War II. One of the most decorated soldiers in American history, a man who had won the Medal of Honor in World War I. But Donovan had retired from government service after the war. President Truman had disbanded the OSS in 1945, and Donovan had returned to his law practice in New York. Everyone knew that story. It was in every history book. So why was he signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? Hartley turned to the final page in the folder. It was a single sheet, heavier stock paper with text that had been stamped rather than typed. The stamps were in red ink, bold and unmistakable. Program status, terminated. Civilian access, prohibited. Research continuation, off-site. Classification level, permanent. Destruction of records, forbidden. Archive protocol, Eclipse vault only. The date stamp read, May 18th, 1953. Below the stamps, in the same handwriting as the October 47 memo, was a single sentence. Incident containment complete. All surviving personnel reassigned. Eclipse Continuity Division assumes oversight. Hartley sat back in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The documents were spread before him on the sorting table, innocuous pieces of paper that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. He knew he should take them to his supervisor. Protocol was clear. Anything unusual, anything that seemed misclassified or particularly sensitive, went through proper channels. That was the rule. But something stopped him. Some instinct, some voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "Once you hand this over, you'll never see it again. No one will. These documents will disappear, and it will be as if they never existed." The thought made him feel paranoid, which bothered him. Hartley prided himself on being rational, methodical. He wasn't prone to conspiracy thinking. He trusted the system, trusted the process. That was why he had taken this job in the first place. But the documents in front of him didn't feel like history. They felt like something alive, something dangerous, something that people might kill to keep hidden. He was still debating what to do, his mind racing through possibilities, when he heard the door to the archive room open behind him. Hartley jumped, his hand instinctively moving to cover the documents. He turned in his chair. 2 men entered. They wore dark suits, conservative cuts, nothing flashy. White shirts, dark ties. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine. One was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with grey at the temples and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime in military or government service. His face was weathered but expressionless, eyes that took in everything without revealing anything. The other was younger, perhaps 30, athletic and alert. He moved with the controlled grace of someone trained in hand-to-hand combat. His eyes scanned the room with professional efficiency, noting exits, angles, positioning. They didn't belong here. Hartley had worked in the archives long enough to recognise the types who came through. Historians, researchers, journalists, sometimes military personnel following up on specific records. These men were something else. "Mr. Hartley," the older man said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a flat tone that expected no response. Hartley felt his throat tighten. "Yes? We need to collect some materials that were incorrectly included in your batch today." The man's eyes went to the folder on the table, to the document spread beside it. That one, specifically, and any others from the same container. His voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. Not quite a threat, but an absolute certainty. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Hartley felt his throat go dry. His mind raced. "Who are you? I need to see authorization before I can release any materials." "Office of Special Investigations." The older man produced a credentials wallet from his inner jacket pocket, flipped it open with practiced ease. The badge looked legitimate, the photo matched his face. The younger man did the same, but Hartley barely looked at them. His eyes were fixed on the younger man, who had moved with subtle efficiency to flank the sorting table, positioning himself between Hartley and the door. The movement had been casual, almost invisible, but its purpose was clear. "This folder was in a declassified container," Hartley said, hearing the tremor in his own voice and hating it. "It was marked for public release. According to the transfer documentation, everything in that box has been through proper review channels. It's part of the public record now." "No," the older man said simply. His tone didn't change. "It's not." He stepped forward and reached for the folder. Hartley's hand moved instinctively to stop him, but something in the man's eyes made him freeze. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator, calm, patient, but absolutely ready to act. The older man gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, sliding them back into the folder in the same order Hartley had found them. The photograph, the list, the memo, the final page. His movements were careful, respectful of the materials, but completely confident. This was not the first time he had retrieved classified documents. "You never saw this file," the man said, looking directly into Hartley's eyes. The folder disappeared into his briefcase with a soft click of the latch. "Do you understand me? You never saw it. It was never in that box. This conversation never happened." Hartley wanted to protest, wanted to assert his rights as an archivist, as a federal employee, as a citizen. He wanted to demand proper documentation, to insist on following protocols. He wanted to ask 100 questions about what those documents meant, why they were classified, what Project Eclipse had been. But the look in the man's eyes stopped him cold. This was not a request. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of authority that came from somewhere far above the pay grade of a junior archivist. "I understand," Hartley heard himself say. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking. The older man nodded once, a brief acknowledgement. Then he turned to his companion. "Check the box. Make sure there's nothing else." The younger man moved to the container Hartley had been processing. He lifted out the remaining supply requisitions with quick, expert hands, checking each page before setting it aside. His movements were methodical, thorough. He found nothing else unusual. "Clear," he said. The older man looked back at Hartley one final time. "You seem like a smart man, Mr. Hartley. Smart enough to understand that some things are classified for good reasons. Some things need to stay buried. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the alternative would be worse. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Hartley nodded. He wasn't sure he did understand, but nodding seemed like the safest response. "Good." The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but something less threatening. Go back to your work. Finish processing the rest of these boxes. Nothing unusual happened today. You found exactly what you expected to find. Supply requisitions from the European theatre. Nothing more." The two men left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like a vault sealing shut. Hartley sat alone in the archive room for a long time after they were gone. The table in front of him was empty now, just. The ordinary supply requisitions spread across its surface. The folder was gone. The photograph, the list, the memo, the termination order, all of it gone as if it had never existed. His hands were still shaking. He noticed that his coffee had gone cold, a film forming across the surface. The security camera in the corner continued its steady blinking, recording an empty room where nothing unusual had happened. Nothing at all. Hartley looked at his watch. 3:17 in the afternoon. He still had 2 hours left in his shift, 9 more boxes to process. He pulled the next container toward him and opened it mechanically. More supply requisitions, boots and fuel and ammunition, the mundane logistics of war, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. He never told anyone what he had seen that day, not his supervisor, who asked at the end of the shift if everything had gone smoothly, not his colleagues during lunch breaks, not his wife when he got home that evening and she asked about his day. He finished his shift, checked out at the security desk, drove home through the late afternoon traffic of suburban Maryland and tried to forget. But he never did forget. The documents haunted him, the names on that list, the strange specializations, Project Eclipse, the signature of a dead man on documents that should not exist. And 20 years later, when he was finally old enough and angry enough and brave enough to break his silence, he would tell his story to a researcher investigating Operation Paperclip, and he would add one final detail that he had noticed in that brief, terrible moment before the documents disappeared. The older man who had taken the folder had a name tag on his briefcase, one of those leather luggage tags that people use when travelling, just visible for a moment as he closed it and prepared to leave. It read, "Eclipse Continuity Division, Act 1, The History They Admit." To understand what Evan Hartley may have stumbled upon in that archive room in June of 1998, we need to start with what we know for certain, the acknowledged history, the version that sits in textbooks and documentaries, the story that has been told and retold until it feels like settled fact. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had endured for exactly 12 years and 4 months. As Allied forces swept through German territory in the final weeks of the war, they discovered something that would change the course of the 20th century. The Nazis had been far ahead of everyone else in certain areas of scientific research. Jet engines that could propel aircraft at unprecedented speeds, ballistic missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, rocket technology that pointed toward the stars, advanced aeronautics that made Allied aircraft look primitive by comparison. The V-2 rocket, which had rained terror on London and Antwerp in the final year of the war, represented a quantum leap in engineering. Standing nearly 50 feet tall and weighing over 28,000 pounds at launch, it could carry a 1-ton warhead across a distance of 200 miles, faster than the speed of sound, striking without warning from the edge of space itself. It was the world's first ballistic missile, and the Allies had nothing remotely like it. The Germans had also made advances in fields ranging from synthetic fuels to infrared optics to wind tunnel design. Some of this was practical engineering that could immediately be applied to military and civilian purposes. Some of it was theoretical work that would take years to fully understand and implement. And the scientists who had built all of this were now up for grabs. The United States Army began a frantic operation to locate and secure German scientists before the Soviets could get to them. Special intelligence teams, organised under a program initially called Operation Overcast, fanned out across occupied Germany. They followed leads from captured documents, interviewed prisoners of war, tracked down research facilities that had been hastily abandoned in the final chaos of the Nazi collapse. They found treasures beyond imagination, hidden laboratories carved into mountains, underground factories where slave labourers had assembled rockets while bombs fell overhead, filing cabinets stuffed with technical drawings and experimental data, and scientists, hundreds of them, eager to trade their expertise for safety in America or Britain, or anywhere that wasn't controlled by the advancing Soviet forces. The Soviets were conducting their own parallel operation, of course. The race was on. Whoever could secure the most German scientific talent would have an enormous advantage in the emerging Cold War. Both sides understood this with crystal clarity. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman signed off on what would eventually become Operation Paperclip. The name, chosen later, came from the paperclips that were used to attach new documentation to the scientists' files. Documentation that would help them enter the United States despite their Nazi backgrounds. Documentation that would, in many cases, obscure or outright lie about what they had done during the war. The official program would eventually bring approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America over the next decade. Some came immediately in the chaotic aftermath of surrender. Others were recruited more carefully, their backgrounds vetted, their value assessed. By the mid-1950s, they were scattered across the United States, working at military facilities, research laboratories, and the newly formed space agency. The most famous among them, the face of the program in the public imagination, was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been the technical director of the German rocket program at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. He had led the team that designed the V2, shepherding it from theoretical concept to operational weapon in just a few years despite constant resource shortages and Allied bombing. He was brilliant, charismatic, and ruthlessly pragmatic. When it became clear that Germany would lose the war, he made careful preparations to ensure that he and his key team members would surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. He got his wish. In May of 1945, von Braun and more than 400 of his colleagues surrendered to American forces in Bavaria. They brought with them truckloads of documents and 14 tons of V2 components that they had hidden in a mine shaft. And in return, America got the foundation of its space program. The story of what happened next has been told many times. Von Braun and his team were brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to Huntsville, Alabama. They taught American engineers everything they knew about rocketry. They redesigned and improved their V2. They developed new concepts. They dreamed of missions to Mars while building weapons for the Cold War. Von Braun would go on to design the Redstone rocket, which put America's first satellite into orbit. He would lead the development of the Saturn V, the massive 3-stage rocket that remains the most powerful machine ever successfully operated by humans. He would become the public face of American space exploration, appearing on television with Walt Disney, meeting with presidents, embodying the promise of American technological supremacy. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969, he did so on technology built by former members of the Nazi rocket program. The Saturn V that lifted Apollo 11 toward the moon had been designed under von Braun's leadership. The trajectory calculations, the staging procedures, the engine designs, all of it bore the fingerprints of Peenemünde. Other paperclip scientists made equally important contributions, if less publicly celebrated. Hermann Oberth, one of the founding fathers of rocketry whose theoretical work had inspired both von Braun and the Soviet program, came to America and continued his research. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen V2 production at the underground Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of slave labourers died, became a key figure in the Saturn program and received NASA's highest honour. Kurt Debus, who had managed rocket launches for the German military and had been an active member of the SS, became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. Hubertus Strughold, whose work in aviation medicine had pushed the boundaries of human endurance in high-altitude flight, helped develop the protocols that would keep astronauts alive in the hostile environment of space. These men, and hundreds of others like them, formed the backbone of American aerospace achievement in the 50s and 60s. They trained a generation of American engineers. They solved problems that had seemed insurmountable. They turned science fiction into science fact. This is the story everyone knows. The story of redemption through science. The story of brilliant minds rescued from a fallen regime and given a second chance to serve humanity, to achieve the dreams that politics and war had interrupted. It's a compelling narrative. It's even mostly true, but it's not the whole truth, because President Truman's order authorizing Operation Paperclip had included one explicit restriction, written in clear language that seemed to leave no room for interpretation. No one who had been involved in war crimes would be allowed entry to the United States. Active participants in Nazi atrocities, those who had ordered or overseen or participated in the horrors of the concentration camps, or the slave labour programs, or the medical experiments, these people would not be given safe harbour on American soil. On paper, this restriction was absolute and non-negotiable. In practice, it was routinely and systematically ignored. Dozens of the scientists brought to America under Paperclip had records connecting them directly to war crimes. Some had been members of the SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organisation, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Nazi regime. Others had held rank in the Nazi Party itself. Still others had overseen slave labour operations where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death building rockets and jet engines. Arthur Rudolph's Mittelwerk factory was a hell on earth, a subterranean nightmare where emaciated prisoners assembled V-2 rockets while guards beat them for working too slowly. More prisoners died building the V-2 than died from the weapons use against Allied cities. Rudolph oversaw it all, making production decisions that he knew would cost lives, meeting quotas that could only be achieved through slave labour. Hubertus Strughold conducted aviation medicine experiments that pushed human subjects to the limits of endurance and beyond. Some of his research had used data from Nazi experiments on concentration camp prisoners, experiments where subjects were frozen to death or killed in pressure chambers. Kurt de Boos had been an active and enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party and the SS. He had worn the uniform, attended the rallies, believed in the ideology. United States intelligence agencies, faced with the reality that the scientists most valuable to America's national security interests often had the most compromised backgrounds, simply rewrote their files. Incriminating documentation was removed or destroyed. Memberships in Nazi organisations were erased from the record. War crimes were attributed to others or dismissed as exaggerations. Clean histories were fabricated, complete with forged documents and coached testimony. The men came to America with pristine records, their past buried in classified archives, their crimes erased from official history. This is acknowledged fact now, not conspiracy theory. Declassified documents have confirmed it in exhaustive detail. Congressional investigations have exposed it. Journalists have written books about it. It remains controversial, a source of ongoing moral debate, but it's no longer secret. The question is asked again and again, should America have done this? Should we have given safe harbour to men who served Hitler, who used slave labour, who participated in the machinery of genocide? Should we have built our space program, our missile defence, our technological supremacy, on the backs of people who committed atrocities? These are important questions. They deserve serious consideration. The ethical compromise at the heart of Operation Paperclip is real and troubling. But perhaps the controversy focuses our attention in the wrong direction. Perhaps the debate about whether we should have brought Nazi scientists to America distracts us from a deeper, darker question. What if some of the Paperclip scientists weren't brought to America for the space program at all? What if there was a second track, running parallel to the public program? A shadow operation that never appeared in any official roster? Scientists whose work was too sensitive, too disturbing, too potentially explosive to ever be acknowledged? What if the 1,600 names we know about were just the surface, the acceptable face of a program that went much deeper? What if Evan Hartley really did find evidence of this in 1998, buried in a mislabeled box where it was never supposed to be found? And what if the reason those two men arrived so quickly, knew exactly what they were looking for, and removed it with such practiced efficiency was because this has happened before? Because there are people whose full-time job is to find these accidental exposures and make them disappear. Act 2. The specialists who don't exist. The first hint that Operation Paperclip might have been larger and stranger than the official history admits appears in declassified State Department cables from the late 1940s and early 50s. These documents, released piecemeal over decades in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, contain occasional references to something that shouldn't exist according to every published history of the programme. They mention Category 2 paperclip specialists. The references are brief, usually just a line or two embedded in longer documents about other matters. A budget allocation for Category 2 specialists requiring special security clearances, a transfer order for Category 2 personnel moving between facilities, a request for additional housing at a military installation to accommodate incoming Cat 2 researchers. But nowhere in any public paperclip documentation, in any of the comprehensive rosters compiled by historians over decades of research, does the term Category 2 appear with any definition or explanation. The official paperclip rosters are remarkably complete. They contain approximately 1,600 names, each with an associated biography compiled from multiple sources: Nazi-era records, American military intelligence files, personnel documents from the various facilities where the scientists worked, immigration records, and in many cases interviews with the scientists themselves or their surviving family members. Each entry includes a birth date, place of birth, educational background, field of expertise, the German institution where they worked during the war, the American facility where they were first assigned, and a brief summary of their subsequent career. The rosters are cross-referenced, footnoted, and have been scrutinised by multiple researchers. They represent decades of painstaking historical work. None of these rosters mention a Category 2 designation. The scientists are all treated as part of a single programme, with variations in security clearance and assignment, but no fundamental subdivision into separate categories. So who are these people mentioned in the State Department cables? A handful of researchers working on the margins of mainstream historical inquiry have attempted to track down the answer. What they've found is fragmentary, contradictory, and deeply strange. The pieces don't quite fit together, and there are enormous gaps where records should be but aren't. The Category 2 specialists, according to these scattered references, worked in fields that didn't fit the public narrative of Operation Paperclip. They weren't rocket scientists developing the next generation of missiles. They weren't aeronautical engineers designing swept-wing jet aircraft. They weren't chemists working on synthetic fuels, or physicists working on nuclear weapons. Their specializations, where they can be identified at all, included fields that sound more like science fiction than legitimate research: human sensory manipulation and control, electromagnetic behavioral research and modification, high-altitude survival experiments involving extreme conditions, neurological interference technology, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation protocols, psychotronic weapons development and field testing, non-local consciousness research and application. These are not the kind of specializations that help you build a rocket to the moon. These are the kind of specializations that suggest research into controlling human beings, influencing thoughts, manipulating perceptions, overriding will and choice. And according to the fragmentary records that mention them, these Category 2 specialists were not sent to NASA facilities or aerospace research centres. They went to military installations with higher security classifications, Department of Defense research laboratories that didn't appear on organisational charts, sites that had cover stories explaining their official purpose, while the real work happened in locked wings that required additional clearances. One location appears with unusual frequency in the scattered references that mention Category 2 specialists, a place called Camp King. Camp King was a real facility, and its history is not entirely secret. It sat in the Taunus Mountains near Frankfurt, Germany, occupying the grounds of a former Prussian military academy. During the American occupation of Germany after World War II, it served as a United States military intelligence site. The official cover was that Camp King handled routine intelligence processing, document analysis, debriefing of prisoners, coordination with other Allied intelligence services. Administrative work, basically, the kind of thing that any occupation force needs. But Camp King's real purpose was considerably darker. Under programs with anodyne code names like Bluebird and Artichoke, which would eventually merge into the infamous MK Ultra, the CIA conducted interrogation experiments at Camp King. They tested drugs on prisoners, They developed psychological techniques meant to break resistance. They explored methods of extracting information through means that went far beyond conventional questioning. The experiments conducted at Camp King in the late 1940s and early 50s would later be described in congressional testimony as torture. Prisoners were kept in isolation for weeks. They were subjected to sensory deprivation. They were dosed with experimental compounds that we now know caused permanent psychological damage. Some died, most were damaged, none consented. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact, confirmed by declassified CIA documents and congressional investigations. But there's one detail about Camp King that has never been fully explained. A declassified memorandum from February 1950, written by a CIA officer stationed at Camp King, mentions that paperclip researchers were assisting with interrogation enhancement work at the facility. The memo discusses scheduling difficulties, security protocols for the research staff, and requests for additional laboratory equipment. But the names of those paperclip researchers remain redacted in every released version of the document. Black bars cover their identities, their backgrounds, their specializations, their German affiliations, all of it hidden behind classification that has never been lifted. Who were they? What were they doing? What expertise could they possibly bring to interrogation research that the CIA couldn't develop on its own? The official answer, repeated in every response to Freedom of Information Act requests that have tried to uncover these names, is that the information remains classified for national security reasons. The identity of intelligence personnel, even personnel from programs that ended decades ago, cannot be revealed. But that explanation doesn't quite make sense. Thousands of CIA personnel from that era have been identified in declassified documents. Names of case officers, station chiefs, technical specialists, all released without apparent concern for national security. The names of paperclip scientists working on rockets and jet engines were never classified in the first place. So why do these particular names remain hidden? One theory, advanced by researchers who have spent years trying to piece together the fragments, is that these weren't ordinary paperclip scientists at all. They were the Category 2 specialists, people whose backgrounds were too sensitive to ever be revealed, because revealing them would expose the true nature of the program. Because if the official paperclip scientist had been involved in conventional war crimes, slave labour and weapons development, what had the Category 2 specialists been involved in? There's a pattern in the fragmentary evidence, a suggestion of purpose that emerges when you lay all the pieces side by side. These specialists weren't just helping with conventional interrogation techniques. They were bringing something new to the table, something that the Nazi regime had been developing in its final years as the war turned against them and desperate men pursued desperate measures. The Nazis had conducted extensive research into what we would now call psychological warfare and behavioural manipulation. Some of this was crude propaganda, the kind of thing any government does. But some of it went deeper, into experimental territory that combined genuine scientific research with pseudoscience and occultism. Experiments in hypnosis and suggestion. Research into the effects of electromagnetic fields on human nervous systems. Attempts to use drugs and sensory manipulation to create programmable soldiers. Wild theories about psychic influence and thought control. Most of it was garbage, a product of ideological thinking divorced from scientific method. But some of it, according to reports that filtered back to Allied intelligence during and after the war, had produced results. Unexpected results. Results that suggested it might be possible to influence human behaviour through means other than conventional persuasion or physical force. And if Operation Paperclip was fundamentally about capturing German scientific expertise before the Soviets could get it, then these specialists would have been among the highest priority targets, not for their ability to build weapons that could destroy cities, but for their ability to build tools that could control minds. The documents that Evan Hartley saw in 1998, if they were authentic, suggested exactly this. A parallel program hidden within the larger paperclip operation, bringing scientists whose work could never be acknowledged to facilities where they could continue research that could never be revealed. Research into the human mind, into consciousness and perception, into the possibility of overriding free will itself, and if that research succeeded, even partially, then the implications are staggering. Because it would mean that somewhere in the classified history of American intelligence, hidden in archives that civilians like Hartley would never normally access, there's evidence that we learned how to manipulate human thought and behaviour in ways that go beyond anything the public has been told. It would mean that the real breakthrough from Operation Paperclip wasn't the Saturn V rocket. It was something far more dangerous. Act 3. Project Eclipse. The memorandum that Evan Hartley saw in that archive room in June of 1998, the one that two men from the Office of Special Investigations arrived to confiscate within hours of his discovery, contained a designation that appears nowhere in any declassified government records: Project Eclipse. No program by that name shows up in budget documents from the late 40s and early 50s. No personnel rosters, no facility assignments, no after-action reports or progress updates. No congressional testimony mentions it. No presidential finding acknowledges its existence. If it existed, it was buried deeper than anything that has been revealed in the decades of investigations and exposures that have gradually pulled back the curtain on Cold War-era intelligence operations. But the date on that memorandum, if Hartley's memory is accurate, is significant. October 21st, 1947. That was a pivotal moment in American intelligence history, a hinge point where multiple storylines converged. 3 months earlier, in July of 1947, something had crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. The official explanation was a weather balloon, part of a classified project to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The alternative explanation became the cornerstone of UFO conspiracy theory. But regardless of what actually happened at Roswell, the incident triggered a wave of interest in unconventional phenomena within the military and intelligence communities. Suddenly, questions that had seemed like science fiction were being taken seriously at the highest levels. In September of 1947, the National Security Act was signed into law, fundamentally reorganizing American intelligence operations for the emerging Cold War. The Act created the CIA, consolidated military intelligence services, and established the National Security Council. It represented a recognition that the United States needed permanent intelligence capabilities, not just wartime expedients. And if Hartley's document was real, then in October of 1947, someone was signing memoranda about continuing research where the Reich left off, about maintaining subjects off the record, about scientific potential outweighing public risk. The signature on that memo was supposedly Major General William J. Donovan. Donovan was a genuine American legend, a figure whose career seemed too dramatic to be real. He had won the Medal of Honor in World War I for leading his battalion through withering German machine gun fire, earning the nickname Wild Bill for his courage under fire. Between the wars, he had practiced law in New York and travelled extensively, developing connections with foreign intelligence services and thinking about how America might need to conduct espionage in a future conflict. When World War II began, Donovan lobbied President Roosevelt to create a centralized intelligence agency. Roosevelt agreed, and in July 1941, the Office of Strategic Services was born with Donovan at its head. He led the OSS through 4 years of war, building an organization from nothing into an effective intelligence service that conducted espionage, sabotage, psychological warfare, and covert operations across multiple theatres. The OSS's achievements were real and significant. It had recruited Nazi defectors, supported resistance movements behind enemy lines, conducted daring operations that saved American lives. Donovan had built something impressive, but when the war ended, President Truman disbanded the OSS. Truman was suspicious of intelligence services, worried about creating an American Gestapo. He wanted military intelligence to return to the military services and civilian intelligence to be handled by the State Department and FBI. Donovan argued against this decision, warning that America would need coordinated intelligence capabilities in the peace that would follow. But Truman's mind was made up. In October 1945, the OSS ceased to exist. Donovan, disappointed and pushed aside, returned to his law practice in New York. That's the official story, the one in every biography and history book. Donovan retired from intelligence work, practiced law, gave occasional speeches about national security issues, but held no official position in the government after 1945. So why would he be signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? The simple answer is that he wouldn't. The document must be a forgery, someone trying to lend authenticity to a hoax by using the name of a famous intelligence figure. But there's a more complicated answer, one that researchers who have studied Donovan's post-war activities have uncovered. Donovan may have been officially retired, but he remained deeply connected to intelligence circles. He advised government officials on security matters. He maintained close relationships with former OSS personnel who had moved into the State Department, the military intelligence services, and eventually the CIA. He worked on classified projects through back channels, operating in the shadows without official title or acknowledgement. Donovan believed in the necessity of intelligence work, in the hard choices that had to be made to keep America safe. He was pragmatic about means and ends. He had ordered operations during the war that violated conventional morality because he believed they served a greater good. He had recruited people with compromised backgrounds, made deals with criminals and collaborators, overlooked ethical lines because winning the war mattered more than maintaining purity. If someone needed to run a program that was too sensitive even for normal classified channels, someone who would ask the right questions without worrying too much about the answers, Donovan would be exactly the kind of person you'd bring in. Someone with experience, connections, and a willingness to operate in moral grey areas. Someone who could make things happen without leaving official fingerprints. Someone who understood that some secrets need to stay secret forever. The memorandum that Hartley saw mentioned designated facilities where the Eclipse researchers would continue their work, separated from the main paperclip operation and hidden under deeper classification. Fragmentary evidence from Freedom of Information Act requests and occasional witness accounts suggest several possibilities. Wright Field in Ohio, which later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was a centre for aerospace research and development. It was also, according to persistent rumours, a repository for unusual materials and classified projects that didn't fit elsewhere in the military structure. The base was enormous, with hundreds of buildings spread across thousands of acres. It would be relatively easy to conduct sensitive research in one corner without anyone else knowing. Fort Detrick in Maryland was officially established as a biological warfare research centre in 1943. Its secure laboratories and isolation from public scrutiny made it an ideal location for sensitive experiments of any kind. If you needed to study things that most people would find disturbing, Fort Detrick offered both the facilities and the security to do it without observation. Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island was created in 1947, supposedly to conduct research into peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But its government funding, extensive security measures, and remote location could have covered work that had nothing to do with nuclear physics. And there are hints, buried in various documents and testimonies collected over the years, of an unlisted facility somewhere near Los Alamos, New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had established multiple secret sites around Los Alamos, some of which continued operating after the war under cover of nuclear weapons research. One of these sites, never officially acknowledged, may have hosted research that had nothing to do with atomic bombs. According to the conspiracy theory built from these fragments, Project Eclipse was focused on continuing and extending research that the Nazis had begun. Psychotronic weapons research. The idea was that electromagnetic fields, properly tuned and directed, could influence human nervous systems at a distance, make people feel fear or confusion, disrupt their ability to think clearly, perhaps even implant suggestions or commands, cognitive behaviour alteration through chemical and psychological means, finding combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and conditioning that could reshape how people think and perceive reality. Not crude brainwashing, but something more subtle and effective. Rapid learning induction, techniques for implanting information or skills directly into the brain, bypassing normal learning processes. The implications for military training would be enormous. Neurological dominance strategies, methods for overriding human will and decision-making, for making people carry out actions against their own interests without consciously recognising what was being done to them. Some of this sounds like pure science fiction, the kind of thing you'd see in a B-movie from the 50s. But research into these areas was very real during the Cold War, and some of it produced results that we're still trying to understand. The CIA's MKUltra program, which has been thoroughly documented through declassified records and congressional testimony, explored many of these same concepts. Between 1953 and 1973, MKUltra conducted hundreds of experiments on unwitting subjects. They dosed people with LSD and other psychoactive drugs, often without the subjects knowing. They researched hypnosis and suggestion. They explored sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. They sought methods of mind control that could be used against enemy agents, prisoners, or anyone else who needed to be controlled. The program's excesses were finally exposed in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings, a series of congressional investigations into intelligence abuses. The testimony shocked the nation. CIA Director Richard Helms formally apologised. Reforms were implemented, files were declassified and made public. But the conspiracy theory surrounding Project Eclipse suggests something more disturbing. MKUltra wasn't the beginning of this research. It was the continuation. Or perhaps more accurately, it was the public-facing version. The program that could be acknowledged if anyone asked too many questions, while the real research continued elsewhere under deeper cover. Eclipse, according to this theory, had started earlier, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. It had recruited the Category 2 paperclip specialists, who knew things that mainstream science hadn't discovered. It had given them facilities, funding, and subjects to experiment on. And it had achieved results that MKUltra scientists would spend decades trying to replicate. Then, something had gone wrong. An incident in May of 1953, catastrophic enough to force the program's termination. At least the termination of Eclipse as it had existed up to that point. But the research didn't stop. It was reorganised, compartmentalised, hidden, under different names and different budget lines. Some of it may have been folded into MKUltra. Some may have continued under the Eclipse Continuity Division that Hartley saw mentioned on that briefcase. Continuity. Not closure, not completion. Continuity. As if the program hadn't ended at all. As if it had simply gone deeper underground. Act 4. The Scientist with No Name. Among the fragmentary references to Category 2 paperclip specialists scattered across decades of partially declassified documents, one designation appears with unusual and troubling frequency. Researcher 47. Not a name, not even initials that might be cross-referenced against other records, just a number, stark and impersonal. Researcher 47 appears in classified budget documents from 1948, in facility transfer orders from 1949 and 1950. In what appear to be progress reports from 1951 and 52. His designation is always the same, never a name, always just the number. His field is listed variously, depending on which document you're looking at, as bioelectromagnetic interface systems, non-local cognition research, field-based neurological manipulation, and in one particularly cryptic entry, simply consciousness alteration through resonance protocols. These are not standard scientific disciplines. They don't correspond to any recognised academic department or research specialty. They sound more like concepts from science fiction than legitimate areas of inquiry. But the documents treat them as real, with funding allocations measured in tens of thousands of 1940s dollars, progress reports detailing experimental results, and security classifications that exceeded normal top-secret designations. The strange thing about Researcher 47, the detail that makes him different from every other scientist associated with Operation Paperclip, is that he seems to have no background, no history before appearing in American custody in 1947. Every other paperclip scientist, including even the Category 2 specialists where their names can be partially uncovered through research, has some kind of paper trail in Germany. University records showing where they earned their degrees, publications in scientific journals even if the journals were obscure, patent applications for their inventions, military service records from the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe, membership records from Nazi Party or In November of the year 2000, a user with the handle TimeTravel0 appeared on a small online forum dedicated to time travel theory. The posts were technical, confident, and oddly specific. Within weeks, the user changed their name to John Titor and began making claims that would haunt researchers for decades. This is not a story about whether time travel is real. This is a story about information that appeared before it should have been possible to know it. About technical knowledge posted online that would not be publicly confirmed until years later. About a pattern of details so consistent that dismissing them requires almost as much effort as believing them. What follows is an investigation into one of the internet's most persistent mysteries. Not because the evidence is conclusive, but because it refuses to be easily explained away. The internet in the year 2000 was fundamentally different from what exists today. Broadband was rare. Most users connected through dial-up modems that screamed and hissed before establishing connection. Social media did not exist in any recognizable form. Forums were isolated communities, small islands of discussion where the same few dozen people might interact for years without ever knowing each other's real names. It was in this environment that something unusual happened, something that would generate more questions than answers for the next 2 decades. Chapter 1. The Man Who Appeared Online. The Time Travel Institute was one of several forums where enthusiasts discussed the theoretical physics of temporal displacement. Most participants were amateur theorists, science fiction fans, or curious individuals exploring ideas at the margins of accepted science. Discussions ranged from serious academic papers to wild speculation about grandfather paradoxes and bootstrap loops. On November 2nd, 2000, a new user appeared. The handle was TimeTravel0. The first post was simple, almost tentative. The user asked about the basics of time travel theory, seemingly gauging the community's level of sophistication. Within days, the tone shifted. TimeTravel0 began answering questions rather than asking them. The posts were different from typical forum content. They lacked the breathless excitement of science fiction fans or the defensive posturing of people trying to prove fringe theories. The writing was calm, procedural, almost bureaucratic. The user wrote like someone filing a technical report. By November 21st, the user had changed their handle to John Titor. They explained that they were a soldier from the year 2038, sent back in time on a specific military assignment. The mission was not dramatic. It did not involve preventing wars or assassinating historical figures. It was a retrieval operation. Titor claimed he had been sent to the year 1975 to obtain an IBM 5100 computer. This machine, he explained, contained specific capabilities that were needed in his time. After collecting the computer, he had stopped in the year 2000 to visit family and to see the world before a series of catastrophic events that he claimed would reshape American society. The story was elaborate, but the internet had seen elaborate stories before. What made Titor unusual was his willingness to engage. He did not simply drop his claims and disappear, he stayed. He answered hundreds of questions over the course of 5 months. He provided technical diagrams. He He discussed physics, sociology, and history. He described daily life in his time with mundane detail that seemed inconsistent with fiction. When users asked about future technology, he did not describe flying cars or utopian cities. He described a world that had regressed in some ways. Centralized infrastructure had failed. Communities were smaller, more localized. Technology existed but was simpler, more rugged, designed for reliability rather than advancement. He mentioned that music was still created, but distribution had changed. He said people grew their own food more often. He described a culture that had been through conflict and had emerged more cautious, more self-reliant, less trusting of large institutions. These details felt real in a way that science fiction often does not. They were boring. They were human scale. They suggested experience rather than imagination. Titer posted photographs. One showed the temporal displacement unit installed in the back of a vehicle. The image was grainy, taken with the low-resolution digital cameras available at the time. The device looked industrial, almost crude. Banks of equipment, cooling systems, control panels. It did not resemble Hollywood's sleek time machines. It looked like something built by engineers working under military constraints. He also posted hand-drawn diagrams explaining how the machine worked. The drawings were technical, but not polished. They looked like field notes, sketches made by someone who understood the mechanics, but was not a professional illustrator. The diagrams included labels, measurements and notations about gravitational fields and particle acceleration. Throughout his time on the forums, Titer maintained a consistent persona. He was polite but not warm. He answered questions directly but did not volunteer unnecessary information. He acknowledged skepticism without becoming defensive. When people called him a liar or a fraud, he responded that he understood their position and that he did not require belief. This restraint was unusual. Most hoaxes escalate. They become more dramatic, more desperate for validation. Titer did the opposite. He became more measured as time went on, as if the novelty of the conversation had worn off and he was simply fulfilling an obligation. On March 24, 2001, John Titor posted his final message. It was brief. He thanked the community for their questions and stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where or when he was going. He did not promise to return. He simply stopped posting, and that was the end. No dramatic farewell, no final proof offered. Just silence. Chapter 2. The specifics that raised eyebrows. What separated John Titor from countless other internet mysteries was the depth and consistency of his technical knowledge. He did not just claim to have travelled through time, he explained in considerable detail how it was done. The device he described was called a C204 temporal displacement unit. It was manufactured, he said, by General Electric in the year 2034. The unit weighed approximately 500 pounds and required a vehicle for transport. Titor initially used a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, but later switched to a four-wheel drive truck, for practical reasons related to the gravitational effects of the device. The machine operated, according to Titor, by creating two microsingularities. These were not naturally occurring black holes but artificially generated ones, created through particle acceleration and magnetic containment. The singularities were held in a stable configuration by an electron injection manifold and a gravity sensor array. When activated, the singularities would generate an intense gravitational field around the vehicle. This field would warp space-time in accordance with Einstein's theory of general relativity. By manipulating the rotation and position of the singularities, the operator could control the direction and magnitude of temporal displacement. Titor referenced Kerr black holes specifically. These are rotating black holes, first described mathematically by Roy Kerr in 1963 as a solution to Einstein's field equations. Unlike Schwarzschild black holes, which are non-rotating and have a single event horizon, Kerr black holes have two event horizons, and an ergosphere where space-time itself is dragged around the singularity. The ergosphere is critical. In theory, it is possible to extract energy from a Kerr black hole through a process called the Penrose process. proposed by Roger Penrose in 1969. Titer suggested that his machine exploited similar principles, using the frame-dragging effect of rotating singularities to achieve temporal displacement. This was not pseudoscience. Frame-dragging is a real phenomenon. It was predicted by Einstein and later confirmed by experiments such as Gravity Probe B, launched by NASA in 2004. The idea that rotating masses can drag space-time around them is accepted physics. Titer also discussed the concept of closed time-like curves, or CTCs. These are paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, theoretically allowing an object to return to an earlier point in time. CTCs are solutions to the equations of general relativity under specific conditions, such as near-rotating black holes, or in the presence of exotic matter with negative energy density. The mathematics Titer referenced were legitimate. The terminology was correct. The concepts were grounded in real theoretical physics, not invented jargon. This level of accuracy is difficult to achieve without a strong background in relativity and cosmology. But Titer went further. He explained that time travel did not occur within a single timeline. Instead, each journey resulted in movement to a parallel world line. He described this using what he called the divergence percentage. Travel back 1 year, and you might diverge by 0.1%. Travel back 30 years, and the divergence could be 1 or 2%. This model aligned with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, first proposed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral dissertation at Princeton in 1957. Everett suggested that every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different outcome. No wave function collapse occurs. All possibilities are realized in separate, non-communicating universes. Titer was applying this framework to time travel. In his model, travelling back in time was equivalent to moving from one branch of reality to another. You could not change your own past because you were never in your own past. You were in a nearly identical but separate world line. This solved the grandfather paradox elegantly. If you travelled back and prevented your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would remain unchanged, still containing a version of you who travelled back. The implications were profound. It meant that time travellers could not prevent disasters in their own timeline. They could only create new timelines where those disasters did not occur. Every action in the past would create a branching point, a new universe diverging from the original. Titer claimed that his machine had a gravitational lock that prevented displacement of more than approximately 60 years. He said this was a safety feature, designed to avoid excessive divergence. The further you travelled, the more different the destination world line would be from your origin. He also explained that the process was not instantaneous. The journey involved what he called a gravity field that ramped up over time. The operator would experience a pulling sensation, followed by a brief period of disorientation as space-time reconfigured. Upon arrival, the field would dissipate, and the vehicle would be in the new time and place. The energy requirements, according to Titer, were substantial but manageable. The device drew power from a small but high-output source, possibly a compact fusion reactor or a contained antimatter reaction. He did not specify, suggesting that some details were classified even in his time. Throughout his explanations, Titer maintained a consistent voice. He was not evangelical. He did not insist that people believe him. He presented information as if filing a report for an audience of engineers. When asked questions beyond his expertise, he admitted he did not know. When challenged on physics, he engaged thoughtfully rather than deflecting. This consistency is difficult to maintain over hundreds of posts spanning 5 months. It requires either genuine knowledge or exceptional discipline. Chapter 3. Predictions made in advance. John Titor made numerous statements about the future. Some were vague, some were specific, and some aligned with events that occurred years after his posts, raising uncomfortable questions about how he could have known. He described a future marked by civil conflict in the United States. He said that by 2015, tensions between rural and urban populations would escalate into something resembling a civil war. he described it not as a traditional war with clear battle lines, but as a slow-burning conflict characterised by federal overreach, local resistance, and increasing breakdowns in trust. In the year 2000, this was not a mainstream narrative. The nation had just elected George W. Bush in a contested election, but the political climate was not yet defined by the extreme polarisation that would characterise later years. Social media had not yet amplified divisions. The idea of civil conflict seemed remote to most people. Titer also mentioned that the conflict would be tied to issues of civil liberties and federal power. He suggested that a crisis, possibly related to terrorism or security concerns, would lead to increased government control. Citizens in rural areas, he claimed, would resist this control, leading to fractures that would deepen over time. By 2001, the September 11th attacks occurred. The Patriot Act was passed. Surveillance expanded. Debates about civil liberties intensified. Whether Titer predicted this or simply observed trends already in motion is unclear, but the alignment is notable. He predicted that CERN would discover miniature black holes around 2001. This did not happen exactly as stated. However, the Large Hadron Collider, which began operations in 2008, was designed in part to test theories related to micro-black holes and higher dimensional physics. Some theoretical models suggested that such black holes could be created, though none have been detected. Titer's claim about CERN is often cited as a failed prediction, but it is worth noting that his timeline divergence model allows for such failures. If his world line was 1 or 2% different from ours, events might occur at slightly different times, or not at all. He also mentioned mad cow disease. At the time, it was already a known issue, particularly in the United Kingdom, but Titer suggested it would become a more significant problem in the United States. By 2003, the first case of mad cow disease was confirmed in a cow in Washington state. The discovery led to widespread panic, beef recalls, and a temporary ban on American beef exports. Again, this was not a dramatic prediction. Mad cow disease was already in the news. But Titer's emphasis on it, in 2000, before it became a major American issue, shows a pattern of being slightly ahead of the curve. He described advances in computer technology that matched later developments. He mentioned multi-core processors, distributed computing, and the importance of legacy system compatibility. He said that in his time, older programming languages and systems were still in use because they were reliable and well understood. This aligns with the reality of enterprise computing, where COBOL and other legacy languages remain critical decades after being developed. Titer also discussed the internet. He said it would become less centralized, more fragmented. He mentioned that in his time, communities used localized networks rather than relying on massive global platforms. This has not fully occurred, but trends toward decentralized systems, mesh networks, and blockchain technologies reflect movement in that direction. Perhaps most unsettling were his social predictions. He described increasing distrust in institutions. He mentioned that people would become more self-sufficient, growing their own food and relying on local communities. He said media would fracture, with people choosing sources that aligned with their existing beliefs. These trends have accelerated dramatically since 2000. The rise of social media, the decline of traditional journalism, the growth of political polarization, and the emphasis on self-reliance and preparedness all align with Titer's descriptions. None of this is proof. Trends can be observed and extrapolated. A skilled futurist could make educated guesses. But the consistency of Titer's vision, particularly for someone writing in the year 2000, is striking. Chapter 4. The IBM connection, the single most compelling piece of evidence in the John Titer case, involves a computer manufactured in the 1970s. Titer claimed that his mission was to retrieve an IBM 5100 portable computer. This was not a random choice. He stated specifically that the IBM 5100 had a unique feature that was not publicly documented. The machine could emulate and translate older programming languages used in mainframe systems from the 1960s and 70s. This capability, he said, was critical in his time. Legacy systems in 2038 still relied on code written decades earlier, and the IBM 5100 was one of the few machines capable of debugging and translating that code. Without it, critical infrastructure would fail. In the year 2000, the IBM 5100 was an obscure piece of technology. Released in 1975, it was one of the first portable computers, though at £50, portability was relative. It was expensive, marketed primarily to businesses and engineers. By 2000, it was largely forgotten, a curiosity for vintage computing enthusiasts but not widely discussed. Titer's claim about the undocumented feature seemed oddly specific. Why choose this particular computer? Why claim it had a secret capability? Years later, engineers who had worked on the IBM 5100 began to speak publicly. One of them was Bob Dubke, who confirmed in interviews that the machine did indeed have an undocumented emulation feature. It could read and translate code from older IBM mainframe systems, including those written in APL and BASIC. This capability was intentionally kept quiet. IBM did not advertise it because they did not want competitors to know. It was a feature built in for corporate clients who needed backward compatibility, but was not included in user manuals or marketing materials. The question becomes unavoidable. How did John Titor know this in the year 2000? If he was a hoaxer, he would have needed access to information that was not publicly available. He would have needed to speak with IBM engineers or find internal documentation. This is not impossible, but it requires assumptions about effort and access that seem inconsistent with an elaborate internet prank. One theory is that Titor was himself connected to IBM, either as an employee or as someone who had worked with vintage computing systems. Perhaps he stumbled upon this information through professional channels and decided to build a story around it. But if that were the case, why choose such an obscure detail? Why not pick something more dramatic, something that could be verified immediately and publicly? The IBM 5100 feature was not confirmed until years after Titor disappeared, when former engineers happened to mention it in interviews. It was not the kind of detail that would generate immediate attention. Another possibility is that Titor made a lucky guess. Perhaps he knew the IBM 5100 was used in legacy systems and speculated that it might have undocumented features. This is theoretically possible, but it requires an implausible level of coincidence. The most straightforward explanation is that Titor knew about the feature because he had access to information from IBM insiders. But even this raises questions. If he had such access, what was his motive? There was no book deal, no movie rights, no monetization of the story. He posted on obscure forums, engaged for 5 months, and disappeared. The IBM 5100 claim remains the strongest single piece of evidence in favour of Titor's authenticity. It is a verifiable fact that was stated before public confirmation. It is a detail that should not have been casually known. And yet, it was. Chapter 5. Vanishing Without Resolution. On March 24, 2001, John Titor posted what would become his final message on the Time Travel Institute forum. The post was brief, professional and unremarkable. He thanked the community for their time and questions. He stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where he was going or whether he intended to return. And then he was gone. No dramatic exit, no final revelation, no attempt to provide proof that would settle the debate once and for all. He simply stopped posting. The account went silent. The conversation continued without him. In the years that followed, researchers attempted to trace his identity. Investigators analysed his IP addresses, though the logs from that era are incomplete. Some claim the posts originated from Florida. Others suggested connections to Texas or California. No definitive location was ever confirmed. Linguistic analysis was conducted on his writing. Researchers looked for patterns, idiosyncrasies, anything that might match other known internet personas. Some believed they found similarities to entertainment lawyers or aspiring science fiction writers. Others argued the analysis was inconclusive. No one came forward to claim credit. This is unusual. Internet hoaxes typically unravel. Someone talks, someone wants recognition, someone cannot resist explaining how they fooled everyone. But with Titor, the silence persisted. In 2003, a woman claiming to be Titor's mother appeared briefly online. She posted under the name K. Titor and stated that her son had returned to his own time. She provided no proof. She engaged minimally with questions. After a short time, she also disappeared. The posts added little to the mystery. If genuine, they only confirmed what Titor had already said. If part of the hoax, they demonstrated remarkable restraint. Most hoaxers would have used such an opportunity to expand the story, to add new details or dramatic twists. Kay Titor did not. She simply stated that her son had left and that she missed him. Attempts to monetize the story came later, but not from Titor himself. In 2003, a book titled John Titor, A Time Traveller's Tale was published. It compiled his forum, posts along with commentary and analysis. The book was released by the John Titor Foundation, an entity with unclear origins. Some speculated that the foundation was created by the original hoaxer, now seeking to profit from the attention. Others believed it was an independent project by people fascinated by the story. The foundation has never revealed who controls it, or whether they have any connection to the original posts. Entertainment lawyer Larry Haber became associated with the foundation. He has represented the interests of the John Titor story in media negotiations, and has been involved in discussions about potential film or television adaptations. Haber has never confirmed or denied whether he knows Titor's true identity. The involvement of a lawyer added fuel to skepticism. It suggested commercial motive, but it also raised questions. If the goal was profit, why wait years to monetize? Why not capitalize on the attention while it was at its peak? The delayed commercialization seemed inconsistent with a planned marketing campaign. Over the years, various individuals have been proposed as the real John Titor. Some have been investigated extensively. None have been definitively proven. The most compelling candidates have all denied involvement, and no evidence has emerged that conclusively links any individual to the posts. The mystery has persisted precisely because it has no clean resolution. There is no confession, no smoking gun, no moment where the curtain is pulled back and the truth is revealed. The case simply remains open, suspended in a state of permanent ambiguity. This lack of closure is itself unusual. It suggests either extraordinary discipline on the part of a hoaxer, or the possibility that there is nothing to confess. Chapter 6. Parallel Timelines and Damage Control. One of the most sophisticated aspects of John Titor's narrative was his explanation of how time travel functioned. He did not describe a single fixed timeline where changes could create paradoxes. He described something far more complex and, intriguingly, more consistent with certain interpretations of modern physics. According to Titor, time travel did not occur along a single linear path. Instead, the universe consisted of infinite parallel world lines, each representing a slightly different version of reality. Every quantum event, every decision, every moment of chance created branching points where timelines diverged. When a time traveller moved backward or forward in time, they did not stay within their original world line. They shifted to a parallel one. The degree of divergence depended on the distance travelled. A short jump of a few years might result in a world line almost identical to the origin. A jump of decades would result in greater differences. Titor used a percentage system to describe divergence. He claimed his world line had approximately a 2% divergence from the year 2000 timeline he was visiting. This meant that major historical events were the same. World War II occurred. The Cold War happened. Technology developed along similar paths. But minor details differed. This framework had profound implications. It meant that paradoxes were impossible. If you travelled back in time and killed your grandfather, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would continue unchanged, still containing the version of you who travelled back. The model also explained why Titor's predictions could fail without disproving his story. If his world line diverged from ours, events that occurred in his timeline might not occur in ours. The civil war he described might happen in his world line but not in ours. CERN might discover micro-black holes in his world line but not in ours. This creates an unfalsifiable narrative. Any failed prediction can be attributed to timeline divergence rather than fraud. Critics argue this makes the story immune to disproof. Supporters argue it makes the story consistent with real theoretical physics. The many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, on which Tita's model was based, is a legitimate scientific framework. It was developed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral thesis at Princeton in 1957. Everett proposed that the wave function never collapses. Instead, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement occur, each in a separate branch of reality. This interpretation has been debated extensively. Some physicists embrace it because it avoids the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Others reject it because it seems to violate Occam's razor by proposing an infinite number of unobservable universes. But the interpretation remains a valid solution to the equations of quantum mechanics. It is taught in university physics courses. It is discussed in peer-reviewed journals. It is not fringe science. Tita applied this framework to macroscopic time, travel. He suggested that the same branching that occurs at the quantum level occurs when traversing time. Each journey creates or accesses a new branch. This would have practical implications for time travellers. They could not use time travel to fix problems in their own timeline. They could gather information, retrieve objects, or observe historical events, but any intervention would only affect the new timeline they entered. Tita claimed that this was well understood in his era. Time travel was used for specific missions, primarily retrieval operations or reconnaissance. It was not used to prevent disasters because such prevention would only benefit alternate timelines, not the origin timeline. This pragmatic approach to time travel felt authentic. It lacked the grandiosity of most science fiction. It was not about saving the world or becoming a hero. It was about logistics, about obtaining specific resources or information under controlled conditions. The framework also provided a built-in explanation for why Tita could discuss future events without fear of changing them. Anything he said would only influence the timeline he was visiting, not his own. His timeline would continue on its path regardless of what he revealed. This created a strange ethical situation. Tita could warn people about future disasters, but those warnings would not save anyone in his timeline. They might save people in the new timeline, but his own loved ones, his own history, would remain unchanged. He acknowledged this in his posts. When asked why he did not try to prevent tragedies, he explained that it would be futile. He could prevent them here, but not there. And his mission parameters did not include intervention. This fatalistic acceptance felt real. It suggested someone who had thought deeply about the implications of time travel and had come to terms with its limitations. Chapter 7. Other cases that do not fit. John Tita is not the only person in history to claim foreknowledge of events or to exhibit information that seems temporally displaced. The historical record contains numerous accounts of individuals who described future technologies, predicted events, or possessed knowledge they should not have had. In 1932, a science fiction story called A Logic Named Joe was written by Murray Leinster. The story described a device that could access all human knowledge instantly, answer questions, and connect people across distances. It predicted the internet with remarkable accuracy, decades before computers were widely available. Was Leinster a time traveller? Almost certainly not. He was a skilled science fiction writer who extrapolated from existing trends. But the accuracy of his prediction demonstrates that foresight is possible without time travel. The question is always where the line exists between extrapolation and impossible knowledge. In 1950, a man named Rudolph Fentz allegedly appeared in New York City's Times Square and was struck by a car. According to the story, he was wearing 19th century clothing, carried old currency, and had no modern identification. Police investigated and supposedly found records of a man by that name who had disappeared in 1876. This story is compelling, but it was later revealed to be fiction. It originated in a short story published in Collier's magazine. The author Jack Finney wrote it as speculative fiction, not as a factual account. Over time, the story was repeated as if it were real, demonstrating how legends can emerge from creative work. The Fentz case is a cautionary tale. It shows how easily fiction can be mistaken for fact, especially when details are specific and the story has emotional resonance. It also shows why the Tita case is different. Tita's posts were not presented as fiction. They were presented as first-hand accounts, and they contained verifiable details that were later confirmed. In the 1980s and 90s, several individuals claimed to have knowledge of future events. Some described technological developments. Others predicted political changes or natural disasters. Most were wrong. A few were disturbingly accurate. In 1984, a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey predicted a series of global crises based on biblical prophecy. Many of the predictions failed, but some, particularly those related to Middle Eastern conflict and nuclear proliferation, aligned with later events. Was this foreknowledge or pattern recognition? The debate continues. In the early 2000s, anonymous posts began appearing on internet image boards, claiming knowledge of future events. Some predicted natural disasters. Others described economic collapses or political upheavals. Most were quickly forgotten. A few remain unsettling. In 2008, a post on a forum claimed that a major earthquake would strike Japan. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami devastated the region. The post did not specify a date. It did not provide precise details, but it mentioned Japan, earthquakes, and nuclear consequences. The Fukushima nuclear disaster followed the earthquake. Skeptics note that Japan is an earthquake-prone region. Predicting an earthquake there is not remarkable, but the timing and the mention of nuclear consequences add a layer of specificity that is harder to dismiss as coincidence. In 2013, an anonymous user on an image board described a pandemic emerging from China that would spread globally and lead to widespread lockdowns. In 2019, such a pandemic began. The post did not name a virus. It did not give a timeline. But the general framework matched. Again, pandemics are not unprecedented. Predicting one is not impossible. But the specific mention of China, the description of global response, and the timing raise questions. These cases do not prove time travel. They are anomalies in a sea of failed predictions. But they share a pattern with the Tita case. They involve information appearing before it logically should. They lack drama. They are not accompanied by grand claims. They simply state something, and later something similar occurs. If time travel were real and operated according to Tita's model, this is what the evidence would look like. Not definitive proof, not public demonstrations, just information, slightly misplaced, occasionally accurate, always deniable. Chapter 8. Government silence and plausible deniability. If time travel were possible, the question of why governments have not confirmed it becomes central. The answer may lie in the nature of the technology itself and the implications it would have for global stability. Time travel, if real, would represent the most significant strategic advantage in human history. It would dwarf nuclear weapons, surveillance systems, or any conventional military technology. A nation with time travel could observe enemy planning before it occurs, retrieve lost intelligence from historical archives, verify the accuracy of historical records, monitor the activities of rival nations in real time without detection, recover lost technologies or knowledge, understand the long-term consequences of policy decisions before implementing them. But these capabilities come with extraordinary risks. The potential for paradoxes, even in a many-worlds framework, could destabilize the fabric of reality. The economic implications would be catastrophic. If time travel were known to exist, markets would collapse. How could contracts be enforced if the past is not fixed? How could property rights be maintained? How could justice systems function? For these reasons, any government possessing time travel would maintain absolute secrecy. Disclosure would not be an option. Even limited acknowledgement would invite scrutiny, espionage, and destabilization. The technology would be compartmentalized, classified at the highest levels, and restricted to a small number of authorized personnel. This creates a problem for verification. If time travel is classified, there will be no public demonstrations, no congressional hearings, no freedom of information requests that yield results. The only evidence would be leaks, accidents, or individuals who travelled and chose to speak. John Tita fits this profile. He claimed to be a soldier on a sanctioned mission. He was not a rogue traveller or a whistleblower. He was operating, he said, within established protocols. His mission had specific parameters. He was retrieving a computer, visiting family and observing the past. If the story were true, this is exactly how a controlled disclosure might occur. Not through official channels, which would be too risky, but through an individual who shared information in a format that was deniable. Internet forums in 2000 were perfect for this. They were obscure, loosely moderated, and easily dismissed as fiction. Titer's posts could be acknowledged without confirmation. Officials could dismiss them as creative writing. No investigation would be required. No resources would be allocated. The information would remain in the public domain, accessible to anyone curious enough to look but never validated. This approach provides plausible deniability. If questions arise, the answer is simple. It was a hoax, an elaborate internet story, entertainment, nothing more. But what if it was not? The strategic value of plausible deniability is immense. Information can be shared without risk. If the information proves useful to certain parties, it can be acted upon. If it proves inconvenient, it can be ignored. The source can be discredited without effort because the source has already discredited itself by claiming to be a time traveller. This is the perfect cover for a leak. It is information hiding in plain sight, protected by its own implausibility. Consider the alternative. If time travel exists and is classified, how else would information escape? Through official channels? Unlikely. Governments do not voluntarily disclose their most sensitive technologies. Through whistleblowers? Possible, but risky. Whistleblowers face prosecution, surveillance, and retaliation. An anonymous post on an obscure forum claiming to be from a time traveller would be dismissed immediately by most people. But it would also be preserved, archived, and accessible. It would enter the public consciousness without triggering a response from authorities. It would be the perfect method for getting information out without getting caught. Silence in this context is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of control. Governments that possess advanced technology do not announce it. They use it quietly, deny its existence publicly, and allow speculation to fill the void. The lack of official response to the Titer case is consistent with this model. No agency has investigated, no official has commented. The story remains in the realm of internet folklore, never quite debunked, never quite confirmed, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Chapter 9. The evidence that cannot be unseen. When all elements of the John Titer case are examined together, a pattern emerges that resists simple explanation. The individual components can be questioned, but the totality presents a more complex picture. The IBM 5100